In the spring of 1944, Adolf Hitler was absolutely convinced that General George S. Patton was about to unleash the largest invasion force in human history directly at Calais, France. He could see it with his own eyes through reconnaissance photos. Hundreds of tanks, countless landing craft, entire armies assembling in southeastern England. He had intercepted radio transmissions confirming troop movements. His spies reported massive buildups. Everything pointed to Calais. There was just one problem. None of it was real. Not a single tank, not one functional landing craft, not even the general commanding this phantom army was where Hitler thought he was. The Allies had just pulled off the greatest magic trick in military history, and the magician-in-chief was the one man Hitler feared most, George S. Patton. If you're fascinated by the incredible stories of World War II deception and military strategy, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're diving deep into the most audacious con job ever pulled on the Third Reich. The year was 1943, and the Allied High Command faced an impossible problem. Everyone knew the invasion of France was coming. The Germans knew it. Hitler knew it. The question wasn't if, but where and when. The Allies had decided on Normandy, but Normandy had a critical weakness. It was obvious. Well, not obvious, but it was within range of English air bases, had suitable beaches, and was the most logical choice for a cross-channel invasion. If the Germans concentrated their forces there, D-Day could turn into a bloodbath that would make the Somme look like a skirmish. The Allies needed the Germans to put their strongest divisions somewhere, anywhere else. They needed to create an invasion that would never happen, to make it so convincing that Hitler would stake his entire defense of Western Europe on stopping it. They needed a ghost. Enter Operation Fortitude, the code name for what would become the most elaborate deception operation ever conceived. It wasn't just one plan, but a coordinated symphony of lies, misdirection, and psychological warfare that would span months and involve thousands of people, most of whom had no idea what they were really doing. The operation had two parts: Fortitude North, which suggested an invasion of Norway, and Fortitude South, the big one, which would convince Hitler that the main invasion would hit Calais. And for Fortitude South to work, they needed a commander so fearsome, so legendary, that the Germans would believe he could only be leading the real invasion. They needed George S. Patton. Now, Patton was a complicated character, to put it mildly. He was brilliant, aggressive, profane, and absolutely convinced that he had fought in past lives as a Roman legionnaire and a Napoleonic cavalry officer. He wore ivory-handled revolvers, wrote poetry, and believed in reincarnation. He was also the finest tactical commander the Americans had, and the Germans knew it. After his performance in North Africa and Sicily, where his Third Army had moved faster and hit harder than anyone thought possible, the German High Command respected him more than any other American general. They studied his tactics, tracked his movements, and feared his next move. German intelligence had files on him inches thick. If Patton was somewhere, that's where the main attack would come from. The Allies knew this, and they were about to weaponize it. But here's the brilliant part. Patton had recently screwed up. In Sicily, he had slapped two soldiers suffering from what we now know as PTSD, calling them cowards. The scandal had exploded in the press, and Eisenhower had been forced to sideline him. Patton was in disgrace, his career seemingly over, or at least that's what the Allies wanted everyone to think. In reality, Eisenhower and the planners saw an opportunity. They would publicly humiliate Patton, make it seem like he was being punished, and then quietly give him command of the most important invasion force in the war. Except this invasion force would be made of rubber, plywood, and radio static. In January 1944, the Allies announced that Patton would command the 1st United States Army Group, known as FUSAG, based in southeastern England, directly across from Calais. On paper, FUSAG was massive, 11 divisions, comprising around 150,000 men, with all the tanks, artillery, and landing craft needed for a major amphibious assault. German reconnaissance flights over England would see exactly what they expected to see: a buildup of epic proportions, all under Patton's command, all pointed at the Pas-de-Calais. The Germans took the bait immediately. Of course, Patton was commanding the invasion. Of course, it would hit Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. Everything made perfect sense, except FUSAG didn't exist. Well, it existed on paper and in the minds of German intelligence, which was all that mattered. The real FUSAG consisted of a handful of staff officers, some radio operators, and the most creative collection of artists, set designers, sound engineers, and illusionists ever assembled in military uniform. This was the Ghost Army, and their job was to make the impossible look real. They started with the basics: inflatable tanks. These weren't toy balloons, but surprisingly convincing rubber replicas that, from the air, looked exactly like Sherman tanks. A crew of 4 men could inflate one of these tanks in about 15 minutes using air compressors. They came with detailed painting to show treads, hatches, and gun barrels. From a German reconnaissance plane flying at altitude, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. The Ghost Army would roll into a field in Kent or Essex, and by morning, an entire tank battalion would appear to have taken up position. They created hundreds of these fake tanks, along with inflatable artillery pieces, trucks, and even entire landing craft sitting in harbors. But visual deception was only part of the equation. The Ghost Army included sonic deception units that would play recordings of tanks moving, troops assembling, and construction work through massive speakers. They'd set these up near fake encampments so that any German agents in England, and there were some, would hear exactly what they expected: the sounds of an army preparing for war. They created fake supply depots, painting plywood crates to look like ammunition boxes and fuel drums. They strung up laundry lines between fake tents to suggest soldiers living there. They even had people drive around the fake tank parks in jeeps, creating tire tracks that would show up in aerial photography. Every detail mattered because German intelligence was good, very good, and if they spotted anything suspicious, the whole operation could unravel. Then there was the radio traffic. This might have been the most important element of all. The Ghost Army had entire units dedicated to creating fake radio communications. They would send thousands of messages every day, all in codes they knew the Germans had broken. These messages discussed supply requisitions, training exercises, leave schedules, and troop movements, all for units that didn't exist. They created entire fictional command structures, with fake colonels and majors issuing orders to phantom battalions. The radio operators were so good at their jobs that they could mimic the fist of real operators, the unique way each person sends Morse code, so German listeners would believe they were hearing real soldiers. They even created fake radio personalities, operators who would send messages in characteristic patterns, building up profiles that German intelligence would track and catalog. The beauty of this approach was that it exploited how intelligence agencies work. The Germans weren't stupid. They were professional, thorough, and skeptical. But that professionalism worked against them. When their reconnaissance flights brought back photos of tank formations, and their radio intercepts confirmed those tanks were there, and their analysts cross-referenced both sources, and they matched perfectly, what conclusion would they draw? That it was all an elaborate fake? That seemed far more unlikely than the simple explanation. Patton was building an invasion force at Calais. Intelligence work is about building a coherent picture from multiple sources, and the Allies were painting exactly the picture they wanted the Germans to see. Patton himself played his role perfectly, though it must have driven him crazy. Here was a man who lived for combat, who believed he was destined for glory on the battlefield, sitting in England commanding an army of ghosts. But he understood the importance of the mission. He made public appearances in southeastern England, inspecting fake units and fake equipment. He gave speeches to non-existent divisions. German spies reported seeing him exactly where he was supposed to be. Meanwhile, the real invasion forces were assembling in southwestern England and in the ports of Southampton and Portsmouth, about as far from Calais as you could get while still being in southern England. The actual commanders, like Omar Bradley and Bernard Montgomery, kept low profiles. Let the Germans watch Patton. Let them think he was the main event. The deception extended to the skies as well. Allied bombing campaigns in the spring of 1944 were carefully orchestrated to support Fortitude South. For every bomb dropped on Normandy, 2 were dropped on Calais. They bombed rail yards, bridges, and coastal fortifications, all to suggest that Calais was being softened up for invasion. They even staged fake commando raids near Calais to make the Germans think the Allies were gathering intelligence for an assault there. Every action, every mission was calculated to reinforce the lie. The Allies weren't just telling a story. They were building an entire alternate reality, one where FUSAG was real, Patton was in charge, and Calais was doomed. But perhaps the most audacious part of Fortitude South involved double agents. The British had managed something extraordinary. They had captured virtually every German spy in Britain and turned them into double agents, feeding false information back to Germany. The operation was called the Double Cross System, and it was masterfully orchestrated by the 20 Committee, so named because 20 in Roman numerals is XX, or double cross. Get it? British intelligence had a sense of humor. These double agents, with code names like Garbo, Brutus, and Tricycle, sent regular reports back to their German handlers, all containing carefully crafted misinformation about FUSAG. The most important of these was a Spanish national named Juan Pujol Garcia, code-named Garbo. The Germans trusted him completely, believed he had built a network of sub-agents across Britain, and valued his intelligence above almost any other source. Garbo didn't actually have any sub-agents. He made them all up, creating fictional characters with entire backstories, personalities, and reporting styles. He sent the Germans thousands of messages, all painting a picture of FUSAG's massive buildup. When the Germans cross-referenced Garbo's reports with their aerial reconnaissance and radio intercepts, everything matched perfectly. How could it not be true? As D-Day approached, the tension was unbearable. The entire operation hung on a knife's edge. If the Germans figured out the deception, if they moved their strongest divisions from Calais to Normandy before June 6th, the invasion could fail. Hundreds of thousands of lives depended on maintaining the illusion. On the night of June 5, 1944, as thousands of ships carrying the real invasion force crossed the English Channel toward Normandy, the Ghost Army went into overdrive. They increased radio traffic from FUSAG to suggest final preparations for an imminent assault. They had planes drop window strips of aluminum foil that created fake radar signatures of a massive fleet heading toward Calais. They even had small boats towing radar reflectors crossing the channel toward Calais, creating the impression of an invasion fleet on German radar screens. Then June 6th came, and the real landings hit Normandy. The beaches ran red with blood as American, British, and Canadian troops stormed ashore under withering fire. But even as the battle raged in Normandy, the deception continued. This was the most critical moment. The Allies needed Hitler to believe that Normandy was a feint, that the real invasion, Patton's invasion, was still coming at Calais. If he believed that, he would hold his panzer divisions in reserve near Calais rather than sending them to Normandy, where they could crush the beachhead. Everything depended on maintaining the lie just a little bit longer. Garbo sent an urgent message to his German handlers on June 9th, 3 days after D-Day. He reported that he had discovered the truth. Normandy was a diversion. The main invasion force, FUSAG under Patton, was still preparing to hit Calais. He even provided specific details about divisions and timing, all completely fabricated. The Germans believed him. Hitler believed him. In one of the most consequential decisions of the war, Hitler kept his strongest armored divisions, including the 15th Army, stationed near Calais for weeks after D-Day, waiting for an invasion that would never come. These were the divisions that could have counterattacked at Normandy, that could have driven the Allies back into the sea in those critical first days when the beachhead was most vulnerable. Instead, they sat idle, waiting for Patton's Ghost Army. By the time Hitler realized he'd been fooled, by the time he ordered these divisions to Normandy, it was too late. The Allies had established their beachhead, brought in reinforcements, and were pushing inland. The deception had worked beyond anyone's wildest hopes. But the story doesn't end there. Even after the truth about Normandy became undeniable, the Ghost Army kept working. They moved with the real armies across France, creating fake divisions and fake buildups to deceive German commanders about where the next attack would come from. They helped feint entire army groups, drawing German reserves to defend against attacks that never materialized, while the real assaults hit elsewhere. In one operation, they convinced the Germans that the 6th Armored Division was in one location when it was actually 50 miles away, preparing for a major offensive. The Ghost Army's techniques evolved throughout the war, becoming more sophisticated, more daring. They weren't just supporting the invasion anymore. They were shaping the entire campaign in Western Europe. Meanwhile, Patton finally got his real command. After D-Day, once the deception was no longer necessary, he was given command of the actual Third Army and unleashed across France. He drove his forces with the same aggression and speed that had made him legendary, racing across France faster than anyone thought possible, encircling German armies, capturing thousands of prisoners. The Germans had been right to fear him. They'd just been looking in the wrong place. Patton's real army did more damage in months than FUSAG had done as a phantom in a year. But ironically, FUSAG's contribution might have been even more valuable. By keeping German divisions tied down at Calais during the critical weeks after D-Day, the Ghost Army had saved thousands of Allied lives and possibly made the difference between success and failure of the entire invasion. The men of the Ghost Army, the artists and engineers who had spent months creating illusions, finally began to get recognition for their work, though much of it remained classified for decades. These were men who had been painters, designers, set builders, and sound technicians in civilian life, suddenly thrust into the most consequential deception in military history. Many of them went on to distinguished careers after the war. One of them, Bill Blass, became one of America's most famous fashion designers. Another, Ellsworth Kelly, became a renowned abstract artist. They had used their creativity not to create art, but to create believable lies, and in doing so, they had changed the course of history. The Germans, for their part, were slow to accept just how completely they'd been fooled. Even after the war, some German generals insisted that there must have been a real FUSAG, that the Allies had simply changed plans at the last minute. The idea that they had been tricked so thoroughly, that they had fallen for inflatable tanks and fake radio messages, was too humiliating to accept. But the evidence was undeniable. When Allied forces overran German intelligence headquarters, they found rooms full of files on FUSAG, detailed reports on its composition, maps showing its dispositions, assessments of its readiness. The Germans had built an entire intelligence apparatus around tracking a phantom. They had dedicated thousands of man-hours to analyzing an army that existed only in their minds and on some rubber decoys in English fields. Operation Fortitude, and particularly the Ghost Army's role in it, represented a new kind of warfare. It wasn't about firepower or numbers, but about information and perception. In previous wars, deception had been tactical, small-scale, and short-term. A fake retreat to draw the enemy into an ambush, a feint to one flank while attacking another. But Fortitude was strategic deception on an unprecedented scale, sustained over months, coordinated across multiple countries, and involving thousands of people all playing their parts in an elaborate theatrical production where the audience was the German high command and the stakes were the freedom of Europe. It showed that in modern warfare, especially against an enemy with sophisticated intelligence capabilities, the battle wasn't just fought on the ground, but in the enemy's mind. If you could control what your enemy believed, you could control their decisions. And if you could control their decisions, you didn't need to fight them at all. You could get them to defeat themselves. The psychological aspect of Fortitude was particularly sophisticated. The planners understood that the best lies are built on truth. They knew the Germans respected Patton, so they used Patton. They knew the Germans expected an invasion, so they didn't try to hide preparations. They just redirected them. They knew the Germans would be watching specific indicators like radio traffic, aerial reconnaissance, and agent reports, so they made sure all those indicators pointed to Calais. They even built in layers of deception within deception. Some of the evidence of FUSAG was deliberately sloppy. designed to be discovered by German intelligence because they knew that the Germans would trust information they had worked to uncover more than information handed to them. It was deception designed by people who understood how intelligence analysts think, how they build confidence in their assessments, and how to exploit those processes. There's a fascinating epilogue to this story. After the war, the deception planners faced a dilemma. They had created techniques and systems that were incredibly effective, but should they share them? On one hand, documenting and studying these operations could help future military planners. On the other hand, revealing the methods might make them less effective in future conflicts. Initially, almost everything about Fortitude and the Ghost Army was classified. Soldiers who had served in these units were sworn to secrecy, often not even able to tell their families what they had done during the war. It wasn't until the 1970s that significant details began to emerge, and even then, some aspects remained classified for decades longer. This secrecy meant that for years, the men who had pulled off one of the greatest achievements of World War II couldn't talk about it, couldn't be recognized for it, couldn't even share their stories with each other. They had helped win the war, and they had to stay silent about it. When the story finally did come out, it captured public imagination in a way few military operations had. There was something both audacious and whimsical about it. Inflatable tanks, fake radio messages, artists and designers defeating the Wehrmacht. It sounded like something from a novel, almost too clever to be true. But it was true, and it had worked spectacularly. The Ghost Army became the subject of documentaries, books, and exhibitions. The surviving members, now elderly, finally got to tell their stories, to explain what they had done, to be recognized as the heroes they were. They had fought with paintbrushes and sound equipment instead of rifles, but they had been just as critical to victory as any infantry division. The legacy of Operation Fortitude extends far beyond World War II. Modern military doctrine still emphasizes deception and information warfare, though the techniques have evolved with technology. Instead of inflatable tanks, modern forces use electronic warfare to spoof radar and communications. Instead of double agents sending telegrams, intelligence agencies wage information campaigns across digital networks. But the fundamental principles remain the same. Understand your enemy's intelligence collection methods, feed them information that confirms their biases, and make them defeat themselves through their own decisions. Every major military operation today includes a deception component, a recognition that in warfare, perception can be as important as reality. There's also a darker aspect to this legacy. The same techniques that fooled Hitler have been used in less noble causes. Governments have used strategic deception to manipulate their own populations, to justify wars, to hide inconvenient truths. The line between legitimate military deception and propaganda, between fooling the enemy and lying to allies, can be uncomfortably thin. The men of the Ghost Army were clear on which side of that line they stood. They were deceiving Nazi Germany to save lives and defeat tyranny. But the techniques they pioneered exist now in a more ambiguous world, used by all sides in conflicts both hot and cold, not always with such clear moral justification. Still, in the context of World War II, there's no ambiguity about Operation Fortitude's value. It was one of the most successful operations of the war, saving countless lives by making the German response to D-Day slower and less effective than it otherwise would have been. The Ghost Army's contribution was essential to that success. They proved that creativity, imagination, and understanding of human psychology could be as powerful as guns and tanks. They showed that a few hundred men with rubber decoys and radio sets could achieve what might have taken divisions to accomplish through force. They demonstrated that war isn't just about destruction, but about deception, misdirection, and outsmarting your opponent. General Eisenhower himself, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, said after the war that Operation Fortitude was one of the decisive factors in the success of D-Day. Without it, he believed the landings might have failed, and if the landings had failed, the war could have dragged on for years longer with unimaginable casualties. Think about that for a moment. The fake army, the phantom divisions, the rubber tanks, and the talented artists operating them, might have saved more lives than any battle won in the conventional sense. Victory didn't come from the biggest guns or the most soldiers, but from the most convincing lie, expertly told and perfectly maintained. In the end, Patton did lead the invasion that defeated Germany, just not the one Hitler was watching. And by the time the Führer realized his mistake, by the time he understood that he had been staring at shadows while the real threat approached from another direction entirely, it was far too late. The Ghost Army had done its job, and the fate of Nazi Germany was sealed not just on the beaches of Normandy, but in the minds of German commanders who had fallen for the greatest deception in military history, a deception so perfect that even after it was revealed, some refused to believe they had been fooled. That's the ultimate measure of success. Not just that the deception worked, but that it worked so well that the victims couldn't accept they had fallen for it. The Ghost Army had created a masterpiece of manipulation, a work of art whose canvas was the German High Command's own intelligence apparatus, and whose paint was their fears, expectations, and belief that they understood their enemy. They understood their enemy, all right. They just didn't understand that their enemy understood them even better.